The wind cut through her threadbare dress like 1,000 tiny knives, and Victoria Brennan could no longer feel her feet as she stood on the auction platform in the center of Riverton, Wyoming, her eyelashes heavy with frost that had formed from her own frozen tears. She had been traveling for 3 weeks in the back of a covered wagon, sleeping on frozen ground, eating scraps when her captors remembered to feed her at all. And now she stood before a crowd of men who eyed her like she was livestock, while the auctioneer's voice droned on about her qualities as though she were a mare being sold to the highest bidder. It was January of 1882, and the temperature had dropped so low that morning that water left in buckets had frozen solid. But Victoria barely registered the cold anymore because she had gone numb inside and out, her spirit as frozen as the landscape around her. The auctioneer, a portly man with tobacco-stained teeth, grabbed her chin roughly and turned her face from side to side so the gathered men could see her features more clearly. Victoria kept her eyes downcast, not wanting to see the faces of the men who might purchase her like she was nothing more than property. She had been orphaned 6 months ago when cholera swept through the small farming community where she had lived with her elderly aunt in Nebraska. And with no family and no money, she had been easy prey for the men who promised her work as a seamstress in a respectable household out west. Instead, they had brought her here to this frozen wasteland to sell her to whoever had the most money and the least conscience. "Do I hear $300 for this fine young woman?" the auctioneer called out, his breath creating white clouds in the frigid air. "She is strong, healthy, and obedient. She can cook, clean, and sew. A fine addition to any household or establishment." Victoria closed her eyes against the shame that washed over her. She was 21 years old, and this was not how she had imagined her life would turn out. She had dreamed of falling in love, of having a family, of building a life with someone who valued her for more than just her labor. Instead, she was being sold like cattle in a town she had never heard of before, surrounded by strangers who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. The bidding started slowly, with a few half-hearted offers from men who looked like they owned saloons or brothels. Victoria felt bile rise in her throat at the thought of what her life would become if one of them purchased her. She had heard stories about women who disappeared into those establishments, never to be seen again, their spirits broken along with their bodies. Then a voice cut through the crowd, clear and strong despite the howling wind. $500. The crowd turned to look at the speaker, and even Victoria raised her eyes to see who had made such a bold offer. A man stood at the edge of the platform, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He moved forward through the crowd with an easy confidence that suggested he was not a man to be trifled with, and when he reached the front of the platform, Victoria could finally see his face clearly. He was younger than most of the other bidders, probably in his late 20s, with sharp features and eyes the color of a summer sky. There was something in his expression that Victoria could not quite read, something that was not cruel or calculating like the others. He looked at her not with lust or greed, but with something that might have been compassion, though she hardly dared to hope that was true. $500, he repeated, his voice steady and sure. "And I will take her right now." The auctioneer looked delighted at the generous offer. "Sold to Dalton Crawford. Come collect your purchase, sir." Dalton climbed onto the platform with easy grace and approached Victoria slowly, as though she were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before she could protest, the warmth of it shocking against her frozen skin. Then he scooped her up into his arms without warning, and she was too weak and cold to struggle as he carried her down from the platform and through the crowd toward a waiting horse. "Please," Victoria whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. "Please do not hurt me." Dalton looked down at her, and his expression softened in a way that made her chest ache. "I am not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "You will only know sunshine with me, I promise you that." Victoria wanted to believe him, but she had learned the hard way that promises from men were often empty. She remained silent as he lifted her onto his horse, a beautiful chestnut mare with a gentle disposition, and then swung up behind her. He wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her and took the reins with his other hand, guiding the horse through the crowded street and out of town. They rode for what felt like hours, though Victoria had lost all sense of time. The landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving, with snow-covered plains stretching as far as the eye could see and mountains rising in the distance like jagged teeth. The wind had picked up, and even wrapped in Dalton's coat, Victoria shivered against the cold. She could feel the warmth of his body behind her, solid and reassuring, and despite her fear and uncertainty, she found herself leaning back against him, seeking whatever comfort she could find. Finally, they crested a hill, and Victoria saw a ranch spread out in the valley below. It was a substantial property, with a large barn, several outbuildings, and a sturdy two-story house made of wood and stone. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth inside, and Victoria felt a surge of longing so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "This is my ranch," Dalton said, his voice close to her ear. "The Circle C. It has been in my family for 15 years, since my father claimed this land and built the first cabin here. He died 5 years ago, and I have been running it alone since then." Victoria nodded but did not trust herself to speak. She had so many questions, but she was afraid of the answers. Why had he purchased her? What did he expect from her? And most importantly, could she trust anything he said? Dalton guided the horse down the hill and into the ranch yard, where he dismounted and then reached up to help Victoria down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet touched the ground, and he caught her around the waist, steadying her until she could stand on her own. Up close, she could see the concern in his eyes and the way his jaw tightened as he took in her thin frame and frozen appearance. "Let us get you inside and warm," he said, and there was an edge of anger in his voice that made Victoria flinch. But when he saw her reaction, he immediately softened his tone. "I am not angry at you. I am angry at the men who did this to you, who brought you here and sold you like you were nothing. You deserve better than that." He led her into the house, and the warmth that enveloped her as soon as she crossed the threshold was almost painful. The main room was spacious and well-furnished, with a large fireplace crackling with flames and comfortable chairs arranged around it. There was a dining table in one corner and a kitchen area in another, and stairs leading up to what Victoria assumed were bedrooms on the second floor. Dalton guided her to one of the chairs near the fire and gently pushed her down into it. Then he disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few moments later with a thick blanket, which he wrapped around her shoulders on top of his coat. He knelt down in front of her and carefully removed her worn boots, revealing feet that were red and nearly frostbitten. His expression darkened, but he said nothing as he began to gently rub her feet, trying to restore circulation. Victoria watched him in stunned silence. No man had ever shown her such kindness, such careful attention. Her father had died when she was young, and her aunt, though loving in her own way, had been stern and practical, not given to tenderness. The men who had captured her had been cruel, and she had expected nothing different from the man who purchased her. But Dalton Crawford was proving to be something entirely unexpected. "Why did you buy me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dalton looked up at her, his hands stilling on her feet. He was quiet for a long moment, as though choosing his words carefully. "I was in town to pick up supplies when I heard about the auction. I went to see what was happening, and when I saw you standing there with ice on your lashes, looking more dead than alive, I knew I could not let those other men take you. I know what they would have done to you, what kind of life you would have had. So I bought you, not because I think you are property that can be owned, but because it was the only way I could save you." "Save me," Victoria repeated, testing the words. "But what do you expect from me in return?" Dalton resumed rubbing her feet, his touch gentle but firm. "I expect nothing from you except what you are willing to give freely. You are not my slave or my property. You are a human being who deserves dignity and respect. I brought you here because this ranch is remote enough that no one will come looking for you, and because I have the resources to protect you if those men who sold you come searching. You can stay here as long as you need to, and when you are ready, if you want to leave, I will help you go wherever you want to go." Victoria stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, but she saw only sincerity in his eyes. It was almost too much to believe, too good to be true, and yet something in her wanted desperately to trust him. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted quietly. "No family, no friends, no money. I am completely alone in the world." "You are not alone anymore," Dalton said firmly. "You have me, and you have this place, for as long as you want it." Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes, the first real emotion she had allowed herself to feel since her capture. They spilled down her cheeks, warm against her frozen skin, and Dalton reached up to gently wipe them away with his thumb. The gesture was so tender, so unexpected, that Victoria felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she had built around her heart to protect herself from further pain. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me." Dalton smiled at her, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less severe. "You are welcome. Now, let me get you some hot food and then you can rest. You look like you have not had a proper meal or a good night's sleep in a very long time." He was right about that. Victoria could not remember the last time she had eaten anything more substantial than stale bread and water, and she had not slept in a real bed since before her aunt died. Dalton disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a bowl of beef stew that was still warm from being kept over the fire. The smell of it made Victoria's stomach growl painfully, and she took the bowl from him with shaking hands. The first bite was heaven. The meat was tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked, and the broth rich and flavorful. Victoria had to force herself to eat slowly, knowing that her stomach would rebel if she ate too quickly after going so long without proper food. Dalton watched her eat with satisfaction, and when she had finished the bowl, he brought her another, along with thick slices of bread slathered with butter. By the time Victoria had eaten her fill, she was feeling more human than she had in weeks. The warmth of the fire and the food in her belly made her drowsy, and she found her eyelids growing heavy. Dalton noticed immediately and stood up, offering her his hand. "Come on, let me show you to your room. You need to rest." Victoria took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. He led her up the stairs to the second floor, where there were 3 doors. He opened the middle one, revealing a spacious bedroom with a large bed covered in quilts, a dresser with a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the ranch. It was simple but comfortable, and to Victoria, it looked like paradise. "This was my mother's room," Dalton said quietly. "She died when I was 12, but I have kept it just as she left it. I think she would be happy to know someone was using it again." "It is beautiful," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Dalton nodded and turned to leave, but Victoria reached out and caught his sleeve. He turned back to her, raising an eyebrow in question. "Will you really let me stay here?" she asked, "without expecting anything from me?" "I gave you my word," Dalton said, "and I always keep my word. You are safe here, Victoria. I promise you that." It was the first time he had used her name, and hearing it from his lips sent a strange flutter through her chest. She released his sleeve and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Dalton gave her one more reassuring smile and then left, closing the door quietly behind him. Victoria stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, hardly able to believe what had happened. Just a few hours ago, she had been standing on an auction block, certain that her life was over. Now she was standing in a warm, comfortable room, with a full stomach and a soft bed waiting for her. And all because of a man who had seen her suffering and decided to do something about it. She walked over to the bed and sat down on the edge, running her hands over the quilts. They were handmade, she could tell, stitched with care and love. She wondered about Dalton's mother, about what kind of woman she had been, and whether she would approve of her son bringing a strange woman into her home. But those thoughts could wait for another day. Right now, Victoria was so tired that she could barely keep her eyes open. She pulled off Dalton's coat and hung it carefully over the back of a chair, then kicked off her boots and climbed under the quilts. The bed was soft and warm, and as soon as her head hit the pillow, Victoria fell into the deepest sleep she had had in months. She woke the next morning to bright sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Had it all been real? Or had she dreamed the whole thing? But no, she was still in the comfortable bedroom, still wearing the same thin dress she had been wearing at the auction. It had all been real. Dalton Crawford had bought her and brought her to his ranch, and he had asked for nothing in return except that she accept his help. Victoria climbed out of bed and walked over to the window, looking out at the ranch spread below. In the daylight, it looked even more impressive than it had the night before. The snow-covered fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and she could see cattle in the distance, dark spots against the white landscape. Smoke rose from the barn, and she could see a figure moving around outside, tall and broad-shouldered in a way that she recognized immediately. Dalton was already up and working, despite the early hour and the cold. Victoria watched him for a few minutes, fascinated by the easy way he moved, the confidence in every gesture. He was not like any man she had ever known, and she found herself wanting to know more about him, to understand what made him different. She turned away from the window and caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging above the dresser. She looked terrible, with tangled hair, hollow cheeks, and dark circles under her eyes. Her dress was stained and torn, barely holding together after weeks of hard travel. She needed a bath and clean clothes, but she had neither. As if on cue, there was a soft knock at the door. "Victoria, are you awake?" "Yes," she called out, her voice still rough from sleep. The door opened and Dalton stepped inside, carrying a basin of hot water and several towels. He set them down on the dresser and then turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "I thought you might want to wash up. I also found some of my mother's old dresses in a trunk in the attic. They might be a bit out of fashion, but they should fit you well enough until we can get you some new clothes made." He gestured to a pile of clothing he had left on the chair, and Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes again. This man, this stranger, was showing her more kindness than anyone had in her entire life. "Thank you," she managed to say. "You are very kind." Dalton shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "It is just common decency. I will be downstairs making breakfast when you are ready." "Take your time." He left quickly, closing the door behind him, and Victoria turned her attention to the basin of hot water. She stripped off her ruined dress and used the warm water and soap to wash away weeks of grime and fear. It felt like she was washing away more than just dirt, like she was shedding the skin of the frightened, hopeless woman she had been, and beginning to emerge as someone new. When she was clean, she turned her attention to the clothes Dalton had left for her. There was a simple but well-made dress in a soft blue fabric, along with clean undergarments, stockings, and even a warm shawl. Victoria dressed slowly, savoring the feeling of clean, comfortable clothes against her skin. The dress fit her surprisingly well, though it was a bit loose in places where she had lost weight during her ordeal. She brushed out her long, dark hair as best she could with the brush she found on the dresser, then braided it and pinned it up in a simple style. When she looked at herself in the mirror again, she hardly recognized the woman looking back at her. She looked almost respectable, almost like a normal person, instead of someone who had been sold at auction the day before. Victoria made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee and bacon. She found Dalton in the kitchen, standing over the stove and cooking breakfast with the same competence he seemed to bring to everything he did. He looked up when she entered and smiled, his eyes warming with approval. "You look much better," he said. "The dress suits you." Victoria felt her cheeks flush with pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you for the clothes and for everything else." "You are welcome. Sit down and have some breakfast. We have a lot to talk about." Victoria sat at the table and Dalton brought over plates loaded with bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes. He poured her a cup of coffee and then sat down across from her, his own plate in front of him. They ate in silence for a few minutes, and Victoria was grateful that he did not seem to feel the need to fill every moment with conversation. Finally, when they had both finished eating, Dalton leaned back in his chair and regarded her seriously. "I meant what I said yesterday. You are free to stay here as long as you want, and I will not force you to do anything you do not want to do. However, if you choose to stay, I do have a proposal for you." Victoria felt her stomach clench with anxiety. Here it was, the catch she had been waiting for. "What kind of proposal?" "Nothing improper," Dalton said quickly, seeing the fear in her eyes. "I am not asking for anything like that. What I am proposing is a business arrangement. This ranch is large, and I work from sunup to sundown just to keep it running. I could use help with the cooking, cleaning, and general household management. If you are willing to take on those tasks, I will pay you a fair wage, provide you with room and board, and treat you with the respect you deserve. You would be my employee, not my slave or my property. And if at any point you decide you want to leave, you will have the money to do so and the freedom to go wherever you choose." Victoria stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. He was offering her a real job with fair pay and decent treatment. It was more than she had dared to hope for. "You would really pay me, of course. Your labor has value and you deserve to be compensated for it. I was thinking $10 a month to start, plus room and board. Does that sound fair to you?" $10 a month was more money than Victoria had ever had at one time in her entire life. With that kind of income, she could save up and eventually buy her own freedom, make her own choices about her future. It was almost too good to be true. "That sounds more than fair," she said quietly. "I accept your proposal." Dalton smiled, looking genuinely pleased. "Good. Then we have an agreement. You work for me, I pay you, and we both benefit from the arrangement. Simple and straightforward." But even as he said the words, Victoria could see something in his eyes that suggested the arrangement might not be quite as simple as he was making it sound. There was a warmth there, an interest that went beyond that of an employer for an employee. And if she was being honest with herself, she felt it too, a pull toward this man who had saved her, who treated her with kindness and respect. But she pushed those thoughts aside. It was too soon, too complicated. She needed to focus on regaining her strength, on building a new life for herself. There would be time to think about other things later. Over the following weeks, Victoria settled into a routine at the Circle C ranch. She woke early each morning and prepared breakfast for herself and Dalton. Then she spent the day cleaning, doing laundry, mending clothes, and preparing meals. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and she took pride in doing it well. The house, which had been clean but somewhat neglected when she arrived, began to shine under her care. Dalton, for his part, was unfailingly respectful and kind. He never raised his voice to her, never made inappropriate demands, and always treated her like a valued employee rather than a servant. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would often sit by the fire and talk. Dalton told her about his life, about growing up on the ranch with his parents, about taking over after his father died and working to build the Circle C into one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. Victoria, in turn, slowly began to open up about her own past. She told him about her childhood, about losing her parents and going to live with her aunt, about the hopes and dreams she had had before cholera and cruel men had stolen her future. Dalton listened without judgment, his eyes full of compassion, and Victoria found herself trusting him more and more with each passing day. As January gave way to February, the worst of the winter cold began to ease, though snow still covered the ground and temperatures remained low. Victoria grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. She put on weight, her cheeks filling out and her eyes losing some of their haunted look. She began to smile more often and even laugh at Dalton's occasional jokes. The ice that had coated her heart on that auction platform was slowly beginning to thaw. One evening in late February, a fierce snowstorm blew in from the mountains. The wind howled around the house, and snow fell so thickly that Victoria could not see the barn from the kitchen window. Dalton came in from checking on the animals, covered in snow and shivering despite his heavy coat. "That is a bad one," he said, stomping the snow off his boots. "We might be snowed in for a few days if it keeps up like this." Victoria helped him out of his coat and hung it by the fire to dry. "I made beef stew for dinner. It should help warm you up." Dalton smiled at her gratefully. "You are an excellent cook, Victoria. I have eaten better in the past 2 months than I have in the past 5 years." Victoria felt a warm glow of pleasure at the compliment. She had worked hard to improve her cooking skills, wanting to prove that she was worth the wages Dalton paid her. "I am glad you enjoy it." They ate dinner together, and then Dalton built up the fire while Victoria cleaned the dishes. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the house, it was warm and comfortable. Victoria found herself feeling more content than she had in a very long time. When she finished with the dishes, she came and sat in the chair across from Dalton, picking up some mending she had been working on. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Victoria glanced up from her sewing and found Dalton watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What is it?" she asked. Dalton was quiet for a moment, as though debating whether to speak. Finally, he said, "I was just thinking about how much this place has changed since you arrived. It feels like a home again, not just a house. I did not realize how lonely I had been until you came here." Victoria set down her mending, her heart beating faster. "I have been thinking the same thing. I never expected to feel safe again after what happened to me, but I do feel safe here. With you." Dalton leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes intense. "Victoria, I need to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully." When I bought you at that auction, it was truly because I wanted to save you from a terrible fate. I had no ulterior motives, no hidden agenda. But these past 2 months, getting to know you, seeing your strength and your kindness, I have developed feelings for you that go beyond those of an employer for an employee. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected that Dalton might have feelings for her, had felt the growing attraction between them, but hearing him say it out loud made it suddenly real and immediate. Dalton continued, his voice earnest. I am not asking you for anything, and I do not want you to feel obligated to return my feelings just because I helped you. You are free to stay here as my employee for as long as you want, whether or not you have any romantic interest in me. But I needed to be honest with you, because I do not want there to be any secrets between us. Victoria sat very still, her mind racing. She thought about all the reasons why she should not get involved with Dalton Crawford. He had bought her at an auction, which created a power imbalance between them. She was dependent on him for her livelihood and her safety. And she had been through so much trauma that she was not sure she was ready for a romantic relationship. But she also thought about the way he made her feel safe and valued. She thought about his kindness, his integrity, the way he treated her with respect and dignity. She thought about the laughter they shared, the comfortable silences, the way her heart lifted every time he walked into the room. And she realized that despite all the logical reasons why she should not, she had fallen in love with him. I have feelings for you too, she said quietly. I have been trying to deny them, trying to convince myself that it was just gratitude or dependence, but it is more than that. I care about you, Dalton. Very much. Dalton's face lit up with joy, and he stood up quickly, crossing the space between them in 2 long strides. He knelt down beside her chair and took her hands in his, looking up at her with such tenderness that it made her heart ache. Victoria Brennan, you are the strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever met. You have been through hell and back, and yet you still have the courage to trust me to build a new life here. I promise you, if you give me a chance, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust. You will only know sunshine with me, I swear it. Victoria felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for once they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against Dalton's, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and soap that clung to him. I believe you, she whispered. I believe you. Dalton reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. May I kiss you? Victoria nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Dalton leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she changed her mind. But she did not want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, with an intensity that both frightened and exhilarated her. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a promise rather than a demand. Victoria felt something inside her unfurl like a flower opening to the sun, all the frozen parts of her heart finally beginning to thaw. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders, anchoring herself to him. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Dalton rested his forehead against hers again, his eyes closed, looking more at peace than Victoria had ever seen him. I want to court you properly, he said. I want to do this right to give you time to be sure of your feelings. I am not going to rush you into anything. Victoria smiled, feeling a lightness in her chest that she had never experienced before. I would like that very much. They spent the rest of the evening talking, making plans, sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, Victoria felt like she had finally found her way to safety, to warmth, to sunshine after the long, cold darkness. Over the following months, Dalton courted Victoria with a patience and tenderness that constantly amazed her. He brought her wildflowers when the spring thaw finally came, and the prairie began to bloom with color. He taught her to ride horses so they could explore the ranch together. He shared his dreams of expanding the Circle C, of building something lasting and good, and he always included her in those plans as though her presence in his future was a given. Victoria, for her part, blossomed under Dalton's care and attention. The frightened, broken woman who had stood on that auction platform with ice on her lashes was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more confident. She learned to laugh freely, to express her opinions without fear, to take up space in the world without apologizing for it. And with every passing day, she fell more deeply in love with the man who had given her back her life. In May, as the weather warmed and the ranch came alive with new calves and fresh grass, Dalton took Victoria on a picnic to a beautiful spot by the river that ran through his property. They spread a blanket on the bank and ate the lunch Victoria had packed, talking and laughing in the warm sunshine. After they had finished eating, Dalton stood up and offered Victoria his hand, pulling her to her feet. "Victoria, there is something I want to ask you," he said, his voice suddenly serious. Victoria felt her heart begin to pound. She thought she knew what he was going to say, but she hardly dared to hope. Dalton took both of her hands in his and looked into her eyes. "These past 5 months have been the happiest of my life. You have brought light and joy into my world, and I cannot imagine my future without you in it. I know we have not been courting for very long, and I know you have been through terrible things that might make you hesitant to trust anyone. But I love you, Victoria Brennan, with all my heart and soul, and if you will have me, I would be honored to be your husband." He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple gold ring with a small diamond set in it. "This was my mother's ring. My father gave it to her when they were married, and she wore it every day until she died. I would be proud if you would wear it now." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so broadly that her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Dalton, I will marry you. I love you so much." Dalton let out a whoop of joy and swept her up into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he finally set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger and then kissed her with a passion that made her toes curl. Victoria kissed him back just as fiercely, pouring all of her love and gratitude and hope for the future into that kiss. They were married 6 weeks later, on a beautiful June day, in the small church in Riverton. There were not many guests, just a few of Dalton's friends and business associates, but Victoria did not mind. All that mattered was that she was standing beside the man she loved, promising to spend the rest of her life with him. The minister who performed the ceremony had given Victoria an odd look when Dalton introduced her as his fiancée, and Victoria suspected he remembered her from the auction. But if Dalton noticed the man's reaction, he gave no sign of it. He stood tall and proud beside Victoria, holding her hand and speaking his vows in a clear, strong voice that left no doubt about his feelings for her. When the ceremony was over, and they had been pronounced husband and wife, Dalton kissed Victoria in front of all the assembled guests, a public declaration of his love and commitment that made Victoria's heart soar. They walked out of the church together as Mr. and Mrs. Crawford, and Victoria felt like she was walking into a whole new life, one filled with promise and possibility. The reception was held at the ranch, and Victoria was touched by how warmly Dalton's friends treated her. Several of the wives pulled her aside to welcome her to the community and offer their friendship, and Victoria realized that she was no longer alone in the world. She had a husband, a home, and now, the beginnings of a social circle. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of during those dark days when she had been a captive. That night, after all the guests had left and the ranch was quiet again, Dalton carried Victoria over the threshold of their home. He did not take her upstairs immediately, though. Instead, he set her down gently in front of the fireplace and took both of her hands in his. "Before we go any further, I need you to know something," he said seriously. "I know that you have been through terrible things, and I do not know the full extent of what those men might have done to you before I bought you. I want you to understand that we can take this as slowly as you need. I will never force you to do anything you are not comfortable with. Your comfort and happiness are more important to me than anything else." Victoria felt a surge of love for this man who was always thinking of her well-being, even on their wedding night. "Dalton, I trust you completely. I am not afraid, not anymore. I want this. I want you." Dalton searched her face, as though looking for any sign of doubt or fear. When he found none, he smiled and leaned down to kiss her softly. "Then let me show you how much I love you, Mrs. Crawford." He swept her up into his arms again and carried her up the stairs to the bedroom they would now share. And as he loved her with tenderness and passion, Victoria finally understood what he had meant when he promised her sunshine. This was it, this feeling of being cherished and desired and safe. This was the warmth that had been missing from her life for so long. The first year of their marriage was everything Victoria had hoped for and more. She and Dalton worked together to run the ranch, with Victoria managing the household and Dalton overseeing the cattle operation. They were partners in every sense of the word, making decisions together and supporting each other through the inevitable challenges that came with ranch life. In the fall, they hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, and Victoria enjoyed having more people around the place. She loved cooking for the men and listening to their stories about life on the trail. She felt like she was finally part of a community, contributing something valuable, and it gave her a sense of purpose she had never had before. As winter approached again, Victoria found herself thinking about the year before, about standing on that auction platform with ice on her lashes, certain that her life was over. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person. The frightened, hopeless woman she had been then bore little resemblance to the confident, happy woman she was now. One evening in early December, as she and Dalton sat by the fire after dinner, Victoria suddenly felt overwhelmed with gratitude for everything that had happened. She turned to her husband and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You remember what you said to me that day you bought me at the auction?" she asked. Dalton nodded, his expression serious. "I said you would only know sunshine with me." "You have kept that promise," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have given me so much more than sunshine. You have given me a home, a family, a future. You have given me myself back. I do not think I have ever properly thanked you for that." Dalton pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You do not need to thank me, Victoria. Loving you, being loved by you, is the greatest gift I have ever received. You have made my life complete in a way I did not even know was possible." They sat there together in the firelight, holding each other, and Victoria felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. She was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. In January, almost exactly a year after Dalton had bought her at the auction, Victoria realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When she finally told Dalton the news, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." Victoria laughed at his enthusiasm, but she was just as excited as he was. The idea of bringing a new life into the world, of creating a family with Dalton, filled her with happiness. This child would be born into love and safety, would never know the kind of suffering Victoria had experienced. She would make sure of that. As her pregnancy progressed, Dalton became even more protective and attentive than he had been before. He insisted that she not overwork herself, hiring a woman from town to help with the heavier household chores. He fussed over her constantly, making sure she was eating enough and getting enough rest. Victoria found his concern both endearing and slightly exasperating, but she loved him all the more for it. In late August, on a hot summer day when the prairie grass was golden and the sky was an endless blue, Victoria went into labor. Dalton rode into town to fetch the doctor and the midwife, and then paced nervously outside the bedroom while the women attended to his wife. Victoria labored for hours, and though it was painful and exhausting, she never felt afraid. She knew Dalton was nearby, knew that she was surrounded by people who cared about her and wanted to help. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Victoria gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The midwife cleaned him up and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Victoria's arms. Victoria looked down at her son's tiny face, at his shock of dark hair and his tiny fists waving in the air, and felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it took her breath away. "Dalton," she called out, her voice weak but happy. "Come meet your son." Dalton practically flew into the room, his face alight with excitement and nervousness. He approached the bed carefully, as though afraid he might break something, and looked down at the baby in Victoria's arms. His expression softened into one of pure wonder and love. "He is perfect," Dalton whispered, reaching out to gently touch the baby's tiny hand. The baby immediately wrapped his fingers around Dalton's thumb, and Victoria saw tears spring to her husband's eyes. "He is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Victoria asked. They had discussed names throughout her pregnancy, but had never quite settled on one they both loved. Now, looking at their son, Victoria waited to see what Dalton would say. Dalton was quiet for a moment, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. "What about James Daniel Crawford?" "James after your father and Daniel after mine." Victoria felt tears spring to her own eyes. She had told Dalton about her father during one of their long evening conversations, about how much she had loved him and how devastated she had been when he died. The fact that Dalton wanted to honor his memory by naming their son after him touched her deeply. "I think that is perfect," she said softly. "Hello, James. Welcome to the world, little one." The first few months with a new baby were challenging, filled with sleepless nights and constant demands. But Victoria and Dalton worked together as a team, supporting each other through the difficult moments and celebrating the small victories. Watching Dalton with their son, seeing the gentleness and patience he showed as he learned to change diapers and soothe a crying baby, made Victoria fall even more deeply in love with her husband. As James grew from an infant into a toddler, the Circle C Ranch continued to prosper. Dalton expanded the herd and bought more land, and Victoria's careful management of the household meant they were able to save money and invest in improvements. They built a new barn, dug a well closer to the house, and planted an orchard that would provide fruit in the years to come. When James was 3 years old, Victoria gave birth to twin girls, Emily Rose and Sarah Grace. Dalton was over the moon with joy at having daughters, and he doted on them shamelessly. Victoria watched her husband play with their 3 children, teaching James to ride and gently rocking the twins to sleep, and she marveled at how much her life had changed. The years passed in a happy blur of birthdays and holidays, of watching their children grow and learn, of working together to build something lasting and good. Victoria became active in the community, helping to establish a school in Riverton and organizing charity drives for families in need. She never forgot where she had come from, the desperation and hopelessness she had felt, and she was determined to help others who found themselves in similar situations. On one of her trips into town, Victoria happened to pass by the spot where the auction platform had once stood. It had been torn down years ago, and now there was a small general store in its place. Victoria stood there for a long moment, remembering that frozen January day when she had stood on that platform with ice on her lashes, certain that her life was over. She thought about the woman she had been then, frightened and alone and hopeless. And she thought about the woman she was now, loved and confident and full of purpose. The journey between those two versions of herself had not been easy, but it had been worth every difficult step. Victoria. "Are you all right?" She turned to find Dalton standing beside her, concern in his eyes. He had come into town with her to pick up supplies, and he must have noticed her standing there, lost in thought. "I am fine," she said, smiling up at him. "I was just remembering." Dalton looked at the spot where the auction platform had once stood, and understanding crossed his face. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "That seems like a lifetime ago, does it not?" "It does," Victoria agreed. "Sometimes I can hardly believe I am the same person who stood there that day." "You are not the same person," Dalton said firmly. "You are so much more than that frightened young woman. You are strong and capable and kind. You are an amazing mother, a wonderful wife, and a force for good in this community. I am so proud of the woman you have become." Victoria leaned into her husband, feeling his solid warmth beside her. "I could not have become this person without you. You gave me the chance to heal, to grow, to become who I was always meant to be." "We gave each other that chance," Dalton corrected. "You have made me a better man, Victoria. You have given my life meaning and purpose. I love you more today than I did the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Victoria turned to face him fully, standing on her toes to press a soft kiss to his lips. "I love you too, Dalton Crawford, with all my heart and soul." They walked back to the wagon hand in hand, ready to return home to their children and their life at the Circle C. As they rode out of town, Victoria looked back one last time at the spot where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. She silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought Dalton Crawford to that auction on that frozen January day, and she promised herself that she would never take for granted the beautiful life they had built together. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. James grew into a strong, responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. The twins were bright and spirited, keeping Victoria and Dalton on their toes with their constant energy and curiosity. In 1891, Victoria gave birth to another son, Thomas William, and their family felt complete. As the children grew older, Victoria and Dalton made sure to tell them the story of how they met, though they softened some of the harsher details for younger ears. They wanted their children to understand that sometimes life could be difficult and unfair, but that kindness and compassion could change everything. They taught their children to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their circumstances, and to always stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves. James, in particular, took those lessons to heart. When he was 18, he witnessed a situation similar to what his mother had experienced. A young woman was being mistreated by her employer in town, and James intervened, offering her a job at the Circle C and a safe place to stay until she could get back on her feet. Victoria had been so proud of her son that day, seeing him follow in his father's footsteps by choosing compassion over indifference. The woman James helped, a sweet-natured girl named Margaret, eventually became his wife, and Victoria delighted in welcoming her into the family. Watching her son with his new bride reminded Victoria of the early days of her own marriage, of the joy and wonder of building a life with someone you loved. As Victoria approached her 50th birthday, she found herself reflecting more and more on the journey her life had taken. She was a grandmother now, with James and Margaret blessing her with 2 beautiful grandchildren. The twins had married as well, Emily to a rancher from the next county over, and Sarah to a shopkeeper in Riverton. Thomas was still young, just 17, but he was already showing signs of being as capable and kind-hearted as his father and older brother. One evening in January of 1902, exactly 20 years after the day Dalton had bought her at auction, Victoria and Dalton sat together on the porch of their home, wrapped in blankets against the winter cold. They were alone, with all the children grown and living their own lives, and the house was quiet in a way it had not been for many years. 20 years, Victoria said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Can you believe it has been 20 years? Dalton reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite the gray in his hair and the lines on his face. Best 20 years of my life, he said simply. Victoria smiled, squeezing his hand back. Mine too. I have been thinking about what my life might have been like if you had not been at that auction that day, if one of those other men had bought me instead. Do not think about that, Dalton said firmly. It did not happen. I was there and I made sure you were safe. That is all that matters. I know, Victoria said, but I cannot help but think about all the women who were not as fortunate as I was, all the people who are still trapped in situations they cannot escape from. It makes me want to do more to help. Dalton turned to look at her, his eyes full of love and admiration. You already do so much, Victoria. The charity work you do, the people you help, the example you set for our children and grandchildren. You have made a real difference in this community. Maybe, Victoria said, but I feel like there is more I could do. I have been thinking about starting a home for women in difficult situations, a place where they can stay safely while they figure out what to do next. We have the resources to do it, and I have the experience to understand what they need. Dalton was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Then he nodded slowly. If that is what you want to do, then I will support you completely. We can use the old foreman's house on the north side of the property. It has been empty for years, but with some work, it could be made into a comfortable home for several women. Victoria felt a surge of excitement and gratitude. Even after all these years, Dalton still supported her dreams and encouraged her to pursue them. Thank you, she said, leaning over to kiss his cheek. Thank you for always believing in me. I always will, Dalton promised. You are the strongest person I know, Victoria Crawford. You have overcome so much and built such a beautiful life. I am honored to be your partner in all of this. They sat together in the fading light, holding hands and watching the sun set over the ranch they had built together. Victoria thought about that frightened young woman with ice on her lashes, standing on an auction platform and certain that her life was over. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that she would find love and happiness and purpose beyond anything she could imagine. But of course, that was impossible. All she could do was live her life in a way that honored the struggle that woman had endured, and use her experience to help others who were still fighting their own battles. Over the next few years, Victoria worked tirelessly to establish her home for women in need. She raised money from wealthy donors, recruited volunteers to help with renovations and daily operations, and personally interviewed every woman who came seeking shelter. The home became known throughout the region as a safe haven, a place where women could go to escape difficult situations and start rebuilding their lives. Victoria poured her heart and soul into the project, drawing on her own experiences to create an environment that was supportive without being controlling, that offered help without judgment. She made sure every woman who came through the doors knew that she had value, that she deserved respect and dignity, and that her circumstances did not define her. Dalton supported Victoria's work completely, contributing money and resources, and sometimes using his influence in the community to help the women find jobs or housing when they were ready to move on. He was immensely proud of his wife and the difference she was making, and he told her so often. As the years passed, Victoria's home helped dozens of women escape difficult situations and build new lives for themselves. Some of them moved on to other towns or states, seeking fresh starts far from their pasts. Others stayed in the area, becoming part of the community and building lives of dignity and purpose. And a few even found love, just as Victoria had, meeting good men who saw them for who they truly were rather than what had happened to them. Victoria kept in touch with many of the women she helped, receiving letters updating her on their lives and thanking her for the second chance she had given them. These letters were precious to her, proof that her work was making a real difference. She kept them in a special box, and sometimes, when she was feeling discouraged or tired, she would read through them and remember why she did this work. In the spring of 1910, Victoria celebrated her 60th birthday surrounded by her large and loving family. All 4 of her children were there, along with their spouses and children. The house was full of laughter and noise and love, and Victoria felt overwhelmed with gratitude for everything she had. As she looked around at the faces of her family, she caught Dalton's eye across the room. He smiled at her, that same warm smile that had made her heart flutter 28 years ago, and she smiled back, feeling the same rush of love and affection she had always felt for him. Their life together had not always been easy. They had faced droughts and harsh winters, financial struggles and personal losses. But through it all, they had faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing year. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Victoria and Dalton sat together on the porch as they so often did. It was warm for a spring evening, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers from the garden Victoria had planted years ago. "I have been thinking," Dalton said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what?" Victoria asked, settling more comfortably against his side. "About how lucky I am," Dalton said simply. "I could have ridden past that auction that day. I could have decided it was not my business, that I could not afford to spend that much money on helping a stranger. But something made me stop, made me look at you standing there with ice on your lashes, and I knew I had to do something. And that decision, that one moment of compassion, gave me everything I ever wanted in life. A wife I love beyond measure, a family that brings me joy every day, a life full of meaning and purpose. All because I chose to help someone in need." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes, as they so often did when Dalton spoke from his heart. "I am the lucky one," she said softly. "You saved my life that day, Dalton. Not just from whatever terrible fate awaited me if one of those other men had bought me, but from despair and hopelessness. You gave me sunshine when all I knew was cold and darkness. You gave me love when I thought I would never be loved. You gave me a life worth living." Dalton pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We saved each other," he said firmly. "You gave my life meaning, Victoria. Before you came, I was just going through the motions, working hard but never really living. You taught me how to love, how to be vulnerable, how to build something that matters. We are partners in every sense of the word, and I would not change a single thing about our life together." They sat there in the gathering darkness, holding each other close, and Victoria felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. Her life had taken her places she never could have imagined, from the depths of despair to the heights of joy. She had known coldness and warmth, darkness and light, fear and love. And through it all, Dalton had been beside her, keeping his promise that she would only know sunshine with him. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Victoria thought about all the women she had helped over the years, all the lives that had been changed because she and Dalton had chosen compassion over indifference. She thought about her children and grandchildren, about the legacy of love and kindness they were building together. And she thought about that frozen January day so many years ago, when she had stood on an auction platform with ice on her lashes, and a cowboy had looked at her and seen not a commodity to be bought, but a human being worth saving. That moment had changed everything, had set in motion a chain of events that had led to this beautiful life she now lived. And Victoria was grateful for every moment of it, for every joy and every challenge, for every sunrise and every sunset, for every laugh and every tear. Because all of it, every single bit of it, had been worth it to end up here, in the arms of the man she loved, surrounded by the family they had built together, living a life of purpose and meaning. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the inevitable changes that time brings. Victoria and Dalton grew older, their hair turning white and their steps becoming slower. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper and more profound with each passing year, rooted in decades of shared experiences and unwavering commitment to each other. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1933, surrounded by 4 generations of family. It was a joyous occasion, with over 60 people gathered at the Circle C Ranch to celebrate the enduring love of Victoria and Dalton Crawford. As Victoria looked around at all the faces, at the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who existed because she and Dalton had found each other, she felt overwhelmed with emotion. When it came time to cut the anniversary cake, Dalton raised his glass to offer a toast. His voice was not as strong as it once had been, but it still carried the warmth and sincerity that Victoria had always loved. 50 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I have ever known, Dalton began, his eyes finding Victoria's across the crowd. I stood before God and our community and promised to love her, honor her, and cherish her for the rest of my life. And I have kept that promise every single day since. Victoria, you have been my partner, my best friend, my greatest love. You have given me a life beyond anything I ever dreamed of, and I thank God every day that I was in Riverton that cold January morning all those years ago. You were sold with ice on your lashes, and I promised you would only know sunshine with me. I hope I have kept that promise. You have, Victoria said, her voice thick with tears. Every single day you have kept that promise. The room erupted in applause and cheers, and Victoria made her way across the room to her husband. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she breathed in the familiar scent of him, feeling safe and loved and cherished. I love you, Dalton Crawford, she whispered into his ear. And I love you, Victoria Crawford, he whispered back. Always and forever. They danced together that evening, moving slowly to music played by their grandson on a fiddle. Victoria rested her head on Dalton's shoulder, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, young again and full of hope for the future. The years melted away, and Victoria was once again that young woman being held in the arms of the cowboy, who had saved her, who had promised her sunshine and had spent 5 decades making good on that promise. As the party wound down and family members began to head home, Victoria and Dalton found themselves alone on the porch once more, watching the stars come out in the vast Wyoming sky. It was a familiar position, one they had taken countless times over the years, and it felt right to be here together at the end of a day celebrating their love. "Do you have any regrets?" Victoria asked suddenly. Dalton looked at her in surprise. "Regrets? About what?" "About anything. About buying me that day, about the life we built, about the choices we made." Dalton was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria waited patiently for his answer. Finally, he shook his head. "Not a single one. Every choice I made, every decision I took, led me to this moment right here. Led me to a life with you, to our children and grandchildren, to the home we built together. How could I possibly regret any of that?" Victoria smiled, feeling the last tiny bit of doubt she had been carrying dissolve like morning mist. "I feel the same way. Even the hard parts, even the pain and the fear I experienced before I met you, all of it was worth it to end up here with you. We have had a good life, you and I," Dalton said, pulling her close. "A very good life." "The best life," Victoria agreed. They sat there together under the stars, an old couple still deeply in love after 50 years of marriage. And as Victoria drifted off to sleep that night, warm and safe in her husband's arms, she thought one more time about that frozen January day when she had stood on an auction platform with ice on her lashes, certain that her life was over. She had been wrong. Her life had not been ending that day. It had been beginning. And what a beautiful life it had been. Victoria and Dalton lived several more years together, each day a gift they cherished. They spent their time surrounded by family, tending to the ranch that had been their home for over 50 years, and continuing the charitable work that had become such an important part of Victoria's legacy. On a warm summer evening in 1937, Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Victoria holding his hand. He was 82 years old, and he had lived a full and meaningful life. Victoria grieved deeply for the loss of her beloved husband, her partner, her best friend. But she also felt grateful for the 5 decades they had spent together, for every moment of love and laughter and companionship they had shared. She continued to live at the Circle C Ranch, now run by James and his sons, surrounded by the family she and Dalton had created together. She continued her work with the Home for Women, finding purpose and meaning in helping others as she had been helped so long ago. And every evening, as the sun set over the Wyoming plains, Victoria would sit on the porch in the chair where she and Dalton had spent so many evenings together. She would watch the sky turn gold and orange and pink, and she would remember the cowboy who had seen her standing on an auction platform with ice on her lashes and had promised her sunshine. He had kept that promise. For over 50 years, he had kept that promise. And even now, with him gone, Victoria could still feel the warmth of his love surrounding her, could still hear his voice telling her that she was strong and capable and cherished. Victoria lived to be 89 years old, passing away peacefully in the spring of 1945, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She had lived a long and extraordinary life, transforming from a frightened young woman with no hope and no future into a pillar of her community, a loving wife and mother and grandmother, and a force for good in the world. At her funeral, James stood before the gathered crowd and told the story of how his parents had met, of how his father had saved his mother from a terrible fate, and how together they had built a legacy of love and compassion that would endure for generations. He spoke of the Home for Women his mother had founded, of the dozens of lives she had touched and changed. He spoke of the enduring love between his parents, a love that had lasted through 5 decades of marriage and beyond death itself. "My mother used to say that my father promised her sunshine," James said, his voice breaking with emotion. And he kept that promise every single day of their life together. But what she did not always acknowledge was that she brought sunshine to him as well. They saved each other, loved each other, and built something beautiful together. And that legacy lives on in all of us gathered here today. Victoria and Dalton were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the Circle C Ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the years of their lives. But their true legacy was not carved in stone. It lived on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their values forward into the world. It lived on in the home for women that continued to operate, helping those in need just as Victoria had been helped. It lived on in the stories that were told and retold, of a cowboy who had chosen compassion over indifference, and a woman who had found the strength to build a new life from the ashes of her old one. And on warm summer evenings, when the sun set over the Wyoming plains in shades of gold and orange, casting everything in a soft, warm light, the family members who gathered at the Circle C Ranch would sometimes swear they could feel the presence of Victoria and Dalton, still together, still watching over the legacy they had built. Because true love never dies. It lives on in the memories we cherish, in the lessons we learn, in the lives we touch. And the love between Victoria Brennan and Dalton Crawford had been true indeed, a love that had transformed both of their lives and created ripples that would be felt for generations to come. She had been sold with ice on her lashes, a young woman with no hope and no future. He had been a cowboy with a kind heart and a strong sense of justice. And together, they had created something extraordinary. A love story for the ages, set against the harsh beauty of the Wyoming plains, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of the human spirit, and the enduring nature of true love. Their story became legend in Riverton and the surrounding areas, told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. Young couples would visit their graves, hoping that some of that enduring love would bless their own relationships. Women in difficult situations would hear the story and find hope that they too could escape and build better lives. And children would grow up hearing about the cowboy who had promised sunshine to a woman with ice on her lashes, and about how that promise had changed everything. The Circle C Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, each new generation adding their own chapter to the family story while honoring the legacy of Victoria and Dalton. The home for women that Victoria had founded expanded over the years, eventually becoming a registered charity that helped hundreds of women annually. A scholarship fund was established in Victoria's name, helping young women from difficult circumstances get an education and build better futures for themselves. And through it all, the spirit of Victoria and Dalton's love remained at the heart of everything. Their descendants carried forward the values they had embodied: compassion, integrity, hard work, and above all, the belief that every person has inherent worth and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The story of their love, beginning on that frozen January day in 1882 and lasting until Victoria's death in 1945, became a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt lost or alone or without options. It proved that circumstances do not define us, that it is never too late for a new beginning, and that love, real love, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds and transform even the darkest situations. Victoria had been sold with ice on her lashes. Dalton had promised her sunshine. And together, they had created a warmth that would never fade, a light that would never dim, a love story that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. It was a story of hope conquering despair, of love triumphing over cruelty, of two souls finding each other against all odds and building something beautiful together. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the difficult beginning, not the challenges they had faced, but the life they had built together and the legacy they had left behind. A legacy of love, compassion, and the unshakable belief that every person deserves their own chance at sunshine.